He hurled boiling coffee at my chest, permanently staining my favorite silk blouse and searing my skin, all because I refused to hand over my titanium credit card to fund his secret life. He screamed at me to give him the money or get out of my own house. I chose to leave in silence. But what he did not realize was that walking out that front door was the first step in dismantling his entire existence. My name is Naomi, and at 34 years old, I had built a life most people only dream of. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship to protect your peace. Trust me, you will want to hear how this ends. It was a typical Tuesday morning in our $2.5 million home in Calabasas. The California sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our custom kitchen, catching the gleam of the marble countertops. I was standing by the espresso machine, dressed for a rare in-person meeting with a federal client. As a freelance cybersecurity consultant, I mostly worked from home, hidden behind screens and firewalls. I made a lucrative living, but I deliberately kept a low profile. My husband Connor was the exact opposite. Connor paced the length of the kitchen island, his designer leather shoes clicking aggressively against the hardwood. At 35, he was a mid-level sales manager who believed he was one handshake away from becoming a billionaire. The problem was, his grand ambitions were always funded by my bank accounts. "Hand over the black card, Naomi," he demanded, slamming his hand flat on the marble. "I have an emergency investment opportunity. A buddy of mine is launching a tech startup today, and if I do not wire him $50,000 by noon, I am locked out of the ground floor." I calmly took a sip of my coffee, feeling the heat radiate through the ceramic mug. "No, Connor," I replied, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. His jaw tightened. His face flushed with that familiar, ugly shade of red. "Excuse me," I said. "No." I set my mug down on the counter. "You still owe me $20,000 from last month. Remember the networking trip to Miami that yielded absolutely zero new clients for your firm? You maxed out the joint account buying drinks for strangers, so you used my personal credit card to cover your hotel suite. Before Miami, it was the $10,000 golf club membership you swore would bring in executive leads. It is an endless cycle of financial parasitism, and I am not funding a $50,000 phantom startup." Connor stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne, which I had paid for, was suffocating. "You are unbelievable," he scoffed, his voice dripping with venom. "You sit in this house all day typing on a keyboard like a glorified computer nerd. You have no idea how the real world works. I am out there hustling. I am the face of this family. You need to support your husband." "I am supporting this family," I reminded him softly. "I pay the mortgage on this house. I pay the property taxes. I pay for the cars." "What exactly are you hustling for, Connor?" That was the breaking point. His ego, fragile and bloated, could not handle the cold, hard facts. He snatched his freshly brewed mug of dark roast coffee from the counter. Without a second of hesitation, he hurled the scalding liquid directly at me. The searing heat hit my chest instantly. Dark brown coffee soaked into the white silk of my blouse, clinging to my skin, burning the sensitive flesh near my collarbone. Drops of boiling liquid splattered against my neck and cheek. The heavy ceramic mug shattered against the stainless steel refrigerator behind me, sending sharp shards clattering across the tile floor. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, processing the sharp sting of the burn. "Give me the money or get out," he roared, his eyes wide with a manic, triumphant fury. "Get out of my house until you learn some respect." Any other woman might have cried. Any other woman might have screamed, dropped to her knees, or begged for forgiveness just to keep the peace. But in my line of work, panic is the enemy. When a secure system is compromised, you do not cry. You isolate the threat, gather the data, and execute a protocol to destroy the virus. Connor was a virus. I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a single word. I simply looked down at my ruined blouse, took a deep breath, and turned my back on him. I walked calmly to the entryway, picked up my leather laptop bag, and opened the heavy oak front door. "Yeah, that is right, walk away," Connor taunted from the kitchen, his voice echoing with arrogant satisfaction. "You will be back begging by tonight." I stepped out into the crisp morning air and closed the door firmly behind me. He thought this was his house. He thought the lifestyle he paraded around in was his birthright. He thought I was retreating in defeat. He had no idea that as I walked toward my car, I was already mentally cataloging the network access codes I was about to revoke. The marriage was over. Now it was time for the audit. The drive down the Pacific Coast Highway toward Marina del Rey was a blur. The adrenaline from the confrontation was beginning to wear off, leaving behind the sharp, stinging reality of the coffee burn across my chest. I pulled my car into the valet line of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, handed over my keys, and walked straight to the reception desk. I booked their premier suite for the week, handing the concierge my platinum card with a perfectly steady hand. Once inside the quiet sanctuary of the suite, I took off my ruined silk blouse and tossed it directly into the trash can. I put on a plush white hotel robe, sat down at the heavy mahogany desk overlooking the marina, and opened my laptop. Connor always mocked my career. He called me a keyboard warrior and told his friends I just stared at code all day, but he conveniently forgot that I built the digital infrastructure of our entire lives. I was a top-tier cybersecurity consultant. I secured networks for federal contractors. Breaking into my own home network was like breathing. I logged into our home router through a secure backdoor I had established years ago. I wanted to see exactly what he was doing. I monitored his real-time web traffic and saw that he was not packing his bags or calling a lawyer. He was sitting in my living room using my high-speed internet logged into his personal email account. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass his weak security protocols. His password was his own birth year followed by the word boss. Predictable. Pathetic. I ran a search query for the $50,000 startup he was so desperate to fund. There was no tech company. There was no pitch deck. There were no ambitious founders waiting for capital. Instead, I found a digital paper trail leading straight to a luxury real estate leasing office in downtown Los Angeles. Connor had been corresponding extensively with a high-end leasing agent for a penthouse apartment overlooking the skyline. Attached to the most recent email was a signed lease agreement. It came with a formal request for a $50,000 wire transfer to cover the exorbitant security deposit and the first 6 months of rent up front. I scrolled down to the signature line. The primary tenant listed on the document was someone named Sienna. I opened a new tab and ran a rapid background sweep on the name and phone number attached to the lease. The results populated instantly. Sienna was 24 years old. She was an aspiring social media influencer with a perfectly curated online aesthetic, currently living in a cramped mid-range apartment complex and clearly searching for a lifestyle upgrade. My husband was not an angel investor trying to secure our financial future. He was a sugar daddy trying to secure a mistress. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. The burn on my collarbone throbbed, serving as a physical reminder of his absolute contempt for me. He was willing to violently scald his own wife just to finance a luxury penthouse for a girl 10 years younger than him. I closed the email thread. I did not throw my laptop against the wall. I did not scream into a pillow or collapse onto the hotel bed in tears. I simply went to work. I opened my primary banking portals, my fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. With a few swift keystrokes, I initiated a hard security freeze on every single credit account linked to his name. The joint checking account, which currently held exactly $15,000 of my recent consulting retainer, was immediately drained. I transferred every single cent into an isolated, secure offshore account under my sole legal control. I systematically blocked his access to our investment portfolios, changed the routing numbers for my incoming client payments, and locked down the equity lines of credit. I severed his digital ties to my wealth, completely leaving him with nothing but the pocket change in his wallet. Just as I hit the final confirmation button, sealing him out of my financial ecosystem forever, my cell phone buzzed loudly against the desk. It was an automated fraud alert from American Express. Someone was already trying to swipe one of the platinum cards I had just disabled. But it was not Connor trying to wire money for his mistress. The alert showed a pending transaction for $4,000, attempting to clear at a high-end designer boutique in Beverly Hills. I stared at the notification, my eyes narrowing. I knew exactly who was holding that piece of plastic, and it proved that the rot in this family went far deeper than just my husband. The phone screen shifted from the banking alert to a sudden flood of green text messages. It was Diane, my mother-in-law. She never reached out to me during business hours unless she needed me to pay for something or wanted to complain about my behavior. Today, it was clearly the latter. I opened the message thread and read the vitriol she had just fired off. Connor just called me, the first text read. He is incredibly stressed out. I cannot believe how selfish you are being about a simple $50,000 investment. You are an unsupportive wife who has absolutely no vision for the future. A second message chimed in immediately after. You are extremely lucky a handsome, sociable man like Connor even tolerates living with a computer nerd who wears sweatpants all weekend. You need to apologize to him tonight and transfer those funds before you ruin his career. I stared at the glowing screen. Diane had always been a master of manipulation. When Connor and I first got engaged, she pulled me aside and told me I was passable but lacked the social pedigree her son deserved. That pedigree apparently meant someone who would blindly fund their generational debt while smiling for country club photos. She had enabled Connor his entire life, convincing him that he was a victim of circumstance, while actively using my money to maintain her own lifestyle. But this was a completely new level of audacity. He had actually called his mother to complain that his wife would not fund his mistress. Did Diane know about Sienna? Did she know her precious son was using my hard-earned money to lease a luxury penthouse for a 24-year-old girl? Before I could even process Diane's sheer delusion, a push notification popped up at the top of my screen from Instagram. Brittany, my 32-year-old sister-in-law, had just posted a new story. Brittany was obsessed with projecting a lavish lifestyle she absolutely could not afford. She was a grown woman who still lived in an apartment co-signed by her parents, spending her days unboxing cheap knockoff jewelry online and pretending she was part of the Los Angeles elite. I tapped the notification. The video showed Brittany sitting in the passenger seat of her leased car, aggressively shaking a pristine, brand-new designer shopping bag at the camera. She squealed with delight as she pulled out a limited-edition quilted leather handbag from the tissue paper. The retail price of that specific bag was exactly $4,000. But it was the caption across the video that made my blood run entirely cold. It read, "Best brother ever spoils me for keeping his little secrets." She finished the text with a winking face emoji and a zipped lip emoji. Keeping his little secrets. The puzzle pieces snapped together with sickening mathematical precision. I toggled back to the American Express application and looked at the exact timestamp of the $4,000 pending charge. It was processed yesterday afternoon. Connor had bought his sister a luxury handbag, using my titanium credit card to buy her silence. Brittany knew about Sienna. She knew about the luxury penthouse downtown. The entire family was complicit. They were all sitting around laughing at me behind my back, actively protecting his infidelity and using my wealth to fund their lavish delusions. The betrayal was no longer just between a husband and a wife. It was a coordinated, calculated attack by a family of financial parasites. And in my world, when you discover a parasite in the system, you do not negotiate with it. You eradicate it. I did not text Diane back to defend myself. I did not block Brittany on social media. Instead, I tapped the customer service icon on my American Express app and requested an immediate high-priority phone call from their fraud department. My phone rang less than 10 seconds later. A polite representative asked how they could assist me today. I kept my voice flat, professional, and devoid of any hesitation. "Yes, I need to report a fraudulent transaction on my account," I said clearly. A charge for $4,000 was made yesterday at a designer boutique in Beverly Hills. My card was physically stolen by a family member without my authorization, and the stolen merchandise is currently in the possession of an accessory to the theft. The representative typed rapidly on the other end of the line. She informed me that because of the high dollar amount, the charge would be reversed immediately, the physical card would be permanently canceled, and the merchant would be formally notified to recover the stolen goods. She warned me that this protocol often involved the boutique contacting local law enforcement to retrieve the luxury item. She asked if I was prepared to press formal charges if the police got involved. Absolutely, I replied without missing a beat. Proceed with the fraud investigation. I thanked her and hung up the phone. Brittany was about to learn a very harsh public lesson about flaunting stolen goods on the internet. And Connor was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to buy a woman's silence with another woman's money. I set my phone down on the mahogany desk, feeling a deep, dark sense of satisfaction. My digital fortress was completely locked down. Now all I had to do was sit back and wait for him to try and pay for dinner. Sitting in my hotel suite, my phone screen transformed into a live feed of his public execution. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and watched the show begin. At exactly 8:45 in the evening, the first notification flashed across my screen. It was an attempted charge for $680 at an exclusive seafood and steakhouse in West Hollywood. The status read declined. I could picture the scene perfectly. Connor always insisted on sitting at the center table to be seen by everyone. He would have ordered the Wagyu tomahawk steak and a bottle of overpriced Cabernet to impress Sienna. When the leather checkbook arrived, he would have casually tossed my titanium card onto the tray, flashing that arrogant smile he used to charm his way through life. 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Attempted charge $680 on our joint debit card. Status declined. Then came the third attempt. A backup travel rewards card. Declined. A fourth card. Declined. I watched the timestamps roll in one after another, each one a testament to his rising panic. I later confirmed exactly how the evening played out from a mutual friend who happened to be dining just 2 tables away. According to her, the waiter dressed in a crisp, white tuxedo jacket stood patiently at first. But as card after card flashed red on the handheld terminal, the atmosphere grew incredibly awkward. Sienna, dressed in a skin-tight cocktail dress, stopped smiling. She started looking around the dining room, shifting uncomfortably under the curious gazes of the neighboring tables. Connor tried to play it off as a bank error. He raised his voice, berating the waiter, demanding they run the cards again because he was a VIP. But the terminal screen did not lie. Insufficient funds, account frozen, with a nearly $700 bill sitting on the table and absolutely no way to pay it. The grand illusion of the wealthy tech investor shattered into a million pieces. He had no cash. He had no secret accounts. My friend watched as Connor, sweating through his custom-tailored shirt, was forced to step away from the table and make a frantic phone call. He called Diane. He had to call his mother. The ultimate humiliation came when he had to hand his cell phone to the waiter. Diane had to dictate her credit card number over the phone to cover her 35-year-old son's romantic dinner with his mistress. The waiter looked at Connor with sheer, unadulterated pity. Sienna sat in mortified silence, scrolling on her phone, pretending she did not know the man sweating profusely across from her. The rich sugar daddy act was completely dead. The dinner was paid for, but the damage was irreversible. Exactly 10 minutes after the restaurant bill was settled, the green text messages from Connor started flooding my phone. The false bravado was gone, replaced by unhinged, desperate rage. "Where the hell are you?" he texted. "Why are the cards declining? Fix this right now. You are humiliating me." Another text immediately followed. "Answer your phone. I have clients. I need those accounts unlocked immediately, or I am calling the police. You cannot steal my money." I actually laughed out loud in the empty hotel room. His money. The absolute delusion of the man was staggering. He was sitting in the passenger seat of his leased car next to a 24-year-old girl he could no longer afford, throwing a digital temper tantrum. He had spent years draining my resources, and the second the tap was turned off, he claimed I was robbing him. I opened the text thread. I read every single furious word he typed. I watched the little typing bubble pop up and disappear as he frantically tried to regain control of a situation he could not understand. He demanded an explanation. He demanded a phone call. He demanded I submit to him like I always did. I did not type a single letter in response. I simply left the read receipts turned on. I wanted him to see the word read at the very bottom of his screen. I wanted him to know I saw his panic, I saw his threats, and I was choosing absolute silence. He was locked out of my life, locked out of my bank accounts, and for the first time in his pampered existence, he had absolutely no safety net to catch him. My phone finally went quiet as the reality of his situation set in. Cutting off his money was a satisfying opening move, but the night was far from over. It was time to dig deeper into the shadows of his perfect family. The silence in my hotel room was absolute, but it did not last long. The quiet was pierced by a specialized vibrating ringtone coming from my secondary device. It was my encrypted work line, a number I only gave to high-level federal clients, and exactly one family member. I checked the caller ID. The signal was routed through a secure virtual private network I had set up years ago, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. It was Terrence. At 34 years old, Terrence was an incredibly skilled veterinary surgeon and a remarkably patient African-American man who had the severe misfortune of marrying my sister-in-law Brittany. Unlike the rest of Connor's family, Terrence actually worked for a living. He built his clinic from the ground up, dealt with sick animals all day, and came home to a wife who treated his income like a limitless slush fund for her fake socialite lifestyle. He was the only person in that toxic family dynamic who had ever treated me with genuine respect. I answered the call. Terrence spoke in a low, exhausted tone. He told me he was sitting in the back office of his clinic with the door locked. I could faintly hear the sound of dogs barking in the background. He did not waste time with small talk. He bluntly informed me that Brittany was currently having a hysterical meltdown in their living room because her brand new designer bag had just been flagged as stolen merchandise by American Express. I did not offer an apology. I simply waited. Terrence let out a dry, humorless laugh. He told me he was not calling to ask for mercy for his wife. He was calling to defect to my side. He said he was completely done. He was sick of the constant financial drain Brittany put on his business. He was sick of the overt greed that poisoned every family gathering. But most of all, he was sick of the subtle, condescending racial microaggressions Diane and Connor casually threw his way when they thought he was not paying attention. He had reached his absolute limit, and watching Connor publicly humiliated at a steakhouse was the final push he needed. Then Terrence told me he had a gift for me. A secure file transfer notification popped up on my laptop screen. It was an audio file. Terrence explained that he had accidentally left his phone recording in his jacket pocket during Diane's Labor Day barbecue last month. It was an event I had skipped to finish a client security patch, and apparently, my absence made me the main course of conversation. I clicked play on the audio file. The recording was surprisingly crisp. I could hear the clinking of beer bottles, the sizzle of the grill, and the ambient noise of the backyard patio. Then Connor's voice cut through the chatter. He sounded arrogant, slurring slightly from the alcohol. He was bragging to his uncle and his mother. I sat perfectly still as I listened to my husband explicitly lay out his master timeline for divorcing me. He laughed loudly as he explained California community property laws to his captive audience. He boasted that because we had never signed a prenuptial agreement, he was legally entitled to exactly half of everything I had built during our marriage. He calculated it right there on the patio. Half of my business accounts, half of my offshore investments, and half the equity in the Calabasas house. I listened to Connor proudly declare that he was going to blindside me with divorce papers by the end of the year, force me to sell my own home, and use the cash payout to buy a permanent luxury residence for a new younger girl he had been seeing. But the worst part was not Connor. The worst part was the background noise. I heard Diane laughing in agreement. I heard Brittany cheering him on loudly, stating that Connor deserved a woman who actually dressed well and knew how to host proper parties, unlike the boring computer nerd he was stuck with. They were actively plotting my financial ruin over grilled hot dogs and potato salad. The recording clicked off. The atmosphere in my hotel room shifted from cold calculation to absolute warfare. This was no longer just about a cheating husband trying to fund his mistress. This was a premeditated conspiracy orchestrated by an entire family of leeches. I spoke into the phone asking Terrence what he wanted in return for this ammunition. He did not hesitate. He told me he wanted a clean divorce from Brittany without her destroying his veterinary practice in the process. He needed financial leverage, and he knew I was the only person ruthless and intelligent enough to help him secure it. I agreed immediately. We formed a silent pact right then and there. Terrence would be my eyes and ears on the inside of their crumbling family structure. He would monitor their panic, feed me their next desperate moves, and keep them completely distracted while I set my final traps. In return, I promised him I would make sure Brittany walked away from their marriage with absolutely nothing but the fake clothes on her back. Connor thought he had a foolproof master plan to steal my empire. He had no idea that I had just recruited the perfect inside man, and together, we were going to systematically destroy every single illusion his family had ever built. The very next morning, I checked out of the Ritz-Carlton and drove straight to Century City. I bypassed the standard family law firms and pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering glass high-rise. My destination was the top-floor home to one of the most ruthless corporate and trust attorneys in Los Angeles. Mr. Harrison was a man who specialized in shielding the assets of the ultra-wealthy. I had retained his services 5 years ago, exactly 1 month before Connor proposed to me. Mr. Harrison sat behind a massive desk of polished walnut looking out over the sprawling city skyline. He was a sharp, meticulous man in his early 50s who rarely smiled, which was exactly why I hired him. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk and placed my laptop down between us. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened the audio file Terrence had sent me and hit play. We sat in silence as Connor's drunken voice filled the pristine office. We listened to my husband brag to his family about his foolproof plan to blindside me with a divorce force, the sale of our $2.5 million home, and walk away with half of my net worth under California community property laws. When the recording ended, Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. He let out a low, dry chuckle. It is always fascinating to hear a man explain the law when his entire legal education comes from a country club bar, Mr. Harrison said, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. He actually believes he is entitled to half the equity in the Calabasas property. He is banking his entire future on it, I replied. He thinks because we never signed a prenuptial agreement, he has an automatic claim to the house. He plans to use the payout to buy a luxury apartment for his 24-year-old mistress. Mr. Harrison opened a thick manila folder on his desk and slowly turned the pages. Your husband has made a fatal miscalculation. A prenuptial agreement is designed to protect assets owned by an individual. But you do not own the Calabasas house, Naomi. I do not own the Calabasas house. Therefore, it cannot be considered marital property, nor can it be divided in a divorce. I smiled. The legal mechanism we had established years ago was finally ready to be triggered. Before Connor and I even walked down the aisle, I had transferred the bulk of my liquid wealth and the deed to the property into an irrevocable trust. On paper, the house was owned entirely by an independent corporate entity. I was merely the primary beneficiary. Connor was legally nothing more than a long-term guest who had violently overstayed his welcome. He had absolutely zero equity, zero ownership, and zero rights to a single brick of that property. The financial trap was flawless, but I needed to ensure the physical execution of his removal was just as impenetrable. I unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my jacket and pulled the collar of my shirt to the side. The skin across my collarbone and upper chest was an angry, blistered red where the scalding coffee had hit me. Mr. Harrison stopped smiling. His eyes narrowed as he examined the burn. He threw a mug of boiling coffee at me yesterday morning when I refused to fund a $50,000 wire transfer for his mistress, I stated plainly. He told me to give him the money or get out of the house. Mr. Harrison buzzed his secretary immediately. He instructed her to bring in a camera to thoroughly document the injuries for the court record. The atmosphere in the room shifted from corporate strategy to aggressive litigation. This changes the timeline significantly, Mr. Harrison said, his tone turning completely lethal. We are not just going to serve him with an eviction notice. I am filing for an emergency restraining order based on domestic battery. A judge will grant this immediately given the physical evidence and the financial abuse documented in your bank records." He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him and began writing rapidly. "By the time I am finished today, Connor will be legally barred from coming within 500 feet of you or the property. If he attempts to enter the house, he will not be violating a civil agreement. He will be committing a criminal offense and he will be arrested on the spot." I watched as Mr. Harrison drafted the documents that would obliterate Connor's entire reality. I told the lawyer that Connor was leaving tomorrow for a weekend getaway in Napa Valley, a trip he believed he had cleverly disguised as a business conference. "Perfect," Mr. Harrison replied without looking up from his legal pad. "Let him go to wine country. By the time he returns, the locks will be changed, the legal trap will be sealed, and I will be waiting for him." I stood up, thanked Mr. Harrison, and walked out of the high-rise with a renewed sense of purpose. Connor thought he had a few more months to bleed me dry before discarding me. He thought he controlled the board, but he was about to come home to a reality so desolate and unforgiving it would break his mind. I pulled my phone out as I walked to my car. It was time to call a moving company. I wanted the house stripped down to the bare floorboards before he ever set foot in Los Angeles again. Thursday night, back at the hotel, my phone buzzed with a text message from Connor. It read, "Heading to a mandatory leadership summit in Napa Valley for the weekend. I need space to think. We will discuss your erratic behavior and the frozen accounts when I get back on Sunday." I stared at the glowing screen, marveling at his absolute audacity. He was actually taking Sienna on a romantic wine country getaway, using the last drops of cash he had, while simultaneously trying to gaslight me into thinking I was the one who needed to apologize. I did not reply. I just opened the security camera application on my laptop and waited. Early Friday morning, I watched the live feed from our driveway. Connor walked out of the front door carrying a designer leather weekender bag I had bought him for his birthday. He loaded it into his leased vehicle, adjusted his sunglasses, and drove off down the manicured street. The moment his car turned the corner and disappeared from the camera frame, I picked up my phone and dialed the number for a premium white glove moving service I had contracted the day before. I gave the dispatcher a single clear instruction. "The target is empty. Send the trucks." Less than an hour later, I pulled my car into the driveway of the Calabasas house, followed closely by 3 massive unmarked moving trucks. A team of 20 professional movers in pristine uniforms poured out of the vehicles. I unlocked the front door and handed the foreman a detailed clipboard. I told him I wanted the property completely sterilized. Everything inside the house belonged to me, and everything was going into a secure, climate-controlled storage facility. They had exactly 8 hours to make it happen. The efficiency of the crew was incredible to watch. They moved through the house like a swarm of highly coordinated locusts, stripping away every single layer of the lavish lifestyle Connor had grown so accustomed to. They started in the living room, rolling up the imported Persian rugs and carefully wrapping the custom velvet sectional sofas in thick protective plastic. The massive 85-inch television was dismounted from the wall, leaving behind nothing but bare drywall and dangling wires. I walked into the kitchen, the exact scene of the assault, and supervised as they dismantled his paradise. The expensive espresso machine he had used to scald me was boxed up and carried away. The towering wine fridge, fully stocked with rare vintages he loved to brag about to his friends, was emptied and loaded onto a steel dolly. They took the imported marble dining table. They took the designer leather bar stools. They even opened the walk-in pantry and packed up the high-end organic groceries I had paid for earlier that week. The wipeout continued upstairs with ruthless precision. The master bedroom was stripped down to the bare subflooring. The California King mattress, the imported silk sheets, the heavy mahogany nightstands, all vanished into the back of the moving trucks. I stood in his massive walk-in closet and instructed the movers to dismantle the custom shelving units I had installed. I let them leave his cheap business suits and golf shirts in a pathetic wrinkled pile on the floor. Everything else, the luxury watches I bought him, the designer shoes, the expensive cologne, was boxed up and taken away. By mid-afternoon, the house was entirely unrecognizable. Every painting had been taken down. Every curtain had been unhooked from the rods. I even had the crew unscrew the smart light bulbs from the recessed lighting fixtures throughout the main floor. The only illumination left came from the natural sunlight pouring directly through the bare glass windows. The beautiful sprawling estate had been transformed into a hollow, echoing cavern of empty space. Every footstep rang out sharply against the bare hardwood floors. Before I dismissed the moving crew and locked the doors, I asked the foreman for one final favor. I walked out to my car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a cheap $5 plastic folding chair I had purchased from a local hardware store on my way over. I carried it through the empty foyer, my footsteps echoing loudly against the bare walls. I walked into the center of the massive cavernous living room and unfolded the chair, setting it down squarely in the middle of the floor. It was the only piece of furniture left in the entire 5,000-square-foot house. It was a perfectly fitting monument to his true net worth. Now all that was left to do was secure the digital perimeter and wait for him to come home to his new reality. I sat in the driver's seat of my car parked halfway down the street and opened my laptop one last time. Connor was arrogant, but he was not completely technologically illiterate. He had installed a comprehensive network of smart cameras around the perimeter of the house, linking them directly to an application on his phone. He checked those cameras obsessively, treating them like his personal surveillance empire. I knew that the moment he opened the app to check on the property, during his drive back from Napa Valley, he would realize the interior cameras were offline, and the driveway was suspiciously empty of my car. I had to feed him an illusion. I accessed the cloud storage servers, where our security footage was backed up. I pulled a mundane 4-hour block of video from a peaceful Tuesday afternoon the previous week. It showed the driveway exactly as it should be, with my car parked in its usual spot, the front porch perfectly staged, and the sun casting the right shadows. Using a specialized script I had written for a federal client to test security vulnerabilities, I hijacked the live feed broadcasting to his phone. I replaced the real-time video with the perfectly looped recording. If Connor checked his phone right now, he would see a perfectly normal, undisturbed house. The digital trap was officially set. It was Sunday afternoon. According to the location tracking beacon I had quietly activated on his leased car hours before he left, Connor and Sienna were currently driving south on Interstate 5. They were exactly 3 hours away from Los Angeles. The clock was ticking down to his total destruction. But just as I closed my laptop to drive back to the hotel, my encrypted work line buzzed. It was Terrence. Terrence spoke quickly, his voice tight with urgency. He told me we had a major problem. Diane had just texted Brittany complaining that she had tried calling my phone 3 times and I was ignoring her. Diane was convinced I was packing my bags to leave him, and she wanted to make sure I did not steal any of Connor's valuable possessions on my way out. She was currently getting into her car to drive over to the Calabasas house to perform a surprise inspection. If Diane showed up and looked through the front window, the entire element of surprise would be ruined. She would call Connor immediately, giving him time to prepare, hire a lawyer, and avoid walking into Mr. Harrison's trap. I told Terrence I needed exactly 2 more hours to finalize the legal paperwork delivery with Mr. Harrison. Terrence told me not to worry, he had it covered. Diane owned a notoriously spoiled, purebred Afghan hound named Bentley. She treated that dog better than she treated most human beings. Terrence logged into his veterinary clinic's patient portal and initiated an automated high-priority emergency alert directly to Diane's phone. A few moments later, Terrence called Diane himself. He put on his best panicked professional doctor voice. He told his mother-in-law that a batch of premium imported dog food she had purchased from his clinic the day before had just been urgently recalled due to a lethal bacterial contamination. He fabricated a story that 3 other dogs were already in critical condition, and because Bentley had eaten the food that morning, she needed to bring him into the clinic for an immediate stomach pump and blood panel, or the dog would not survive the night. It worked flawlessly. Diane panicked entirely, forgetting about her mission to spy on me. She rushed Bentley into her car and sped in the opposite direction toward Terrence's clinic. Terrence texted me 5 minutes later to confirm she had arrived in tears, and he was currently placing the perfectly healthy dog in a comfortable observation suite while he ran a series of incredibly slow, unnecessary diagnostic tests. Diane was officially neutralized for the rest of the afternoon. I let out a long breath and put my car in drive. Every single moving part was operating in perfect synchronization. The mother-in-law was distracted in a waiting room crying over a healthy dog. The sister-in-law was at home completely unaware she was about to be served divorce papers. And my husband was cruising down the highway with his mistress, confidently believing he was returning to a $2.5 million luxury estate he could legally conquer. I smiled as I navigated the winding roads back toward Century City. The stage was empty, the audience was seated, and the main event was about to begin. I sat in my hotel room, a glass of Cabernet in hand, watching the live feed from a discreet pinhole camera I had left embedded in the living room ceiling smoke detector. It was just past 6 in the evening when Connor pulled into the driveway. He stepped out of his leased vehicle, stretching his arms, looking every bit the arrogant tech executive returning from a luxurious weekend of wine tasting. Sienna stepped out of the passenger side, adjusting her designer dress. I could see Connor gesturing broadly to the exterior of the house, giving her the grand tour speech. He pointed to the manicured lawn, the custom stonework, and the massive oak front door. He was inflating his own ego, preparing to show off his kingdom. Connor punched his security code into the keypad. The heavy door swung open. He stepped inside, turning with a sweeping gesture to welcome Sienna into the foyer. But the grand reveal died instantly in his throat. The smug smile slid right off his face. Sienna walked in behind him, her heels clicking sharply against the bare hardwood. That single click echoed loudly, bouncing off the empty walls and soaring up into the vaulted ceiling. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. There was no Persian rug to muffle their steps. There was no custom velvet sofa. There was no massive television. There was only vast, empty space, illuminated by the fading evening light. Sienna stopped dead in her tracks. She slowly lowered her sunglasses, her eyes scanning the barren room. She looked at the bare walls where expensive artwork used to hang. She looked at the kitchen completely stripped of its bar stools, its espresso machine, and the towering wine fridge Connor loved to boast about. Then her eyes landed on the single $5 plastic folding chair sitting squarely in the middle of the massive living room. She turned to Connor, her expression morphing rapidly from confusion to deep burning anger. "What is this, Connor?" she demanded. Her voice was sharp, echoing harshly in the empty space. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Connor was hyperventilating. He spun around in circles, his hands gripping his hair in disbelief. He ran into the kitchen, yanking open empty cabinets. He sprinted toward the stairs, looking up at the stripped hallway. "Where is my stuff?" he yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Where is my furniture?" He bounded up the stairs, 2 at a time. I watched him on the secondary camera feed as he rushed into the master bedroom. It was completely empty. He ran into the massive walk-in closet. The only things left were his cheap business suits and golf shirts piled unceremoniously on the bare subflooring. Every luxury watch I had bought him, every pair of designer shoes completely gone. He ran back downstairs, panting heavily, sweat soaking through the collar of his shirt. Sienna was standing with her arms crossed, her posture entirely defensive and aggressive. "Your furniture," she scoffed loudly as he reached the bottom of the stairs. "Are you out of your mind? You told me you owned a $2.5 million estate. You told me you were a wealthy investor. You brought me to an empty, foreclosed house. You are a complete fraud. I swear to you, this is my house." Connor pleaded, his face pale and slick with sweat. He pointed frantically around the empty room. There was a custom sofa right there. I had a fully stocked wine cellar. We have been robbed. Someone cleaned us out. They took absolutely everything. Sienna let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut right through his panic. "Robbed," she spat back at him. "Nobody breaks into a house and steals the light bulbs, Connor. Nobody steals the curtains and the pantry food. You lied to me from the very beginning. You could not even pay for a steak dinner a few nights ago. You probably rented this place for the weekend just to impress me, and the real owners moved their stuff out. You are completely pathetic." Connor was spiraling. His perfect facade was crumbling right in front of the 24-year-old girl he had risked his entire marriage for. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking violently. "I am calling the police," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the empty shadows of the room. "I am calling 911. A professional crime ring must have backed a massive truck up to the house. I will have them tracked down. I will have them all arrested. He aggressively tapped the screen of his phone, dialing the emergency number. He was completely unhinged, breathing heavily, entirely convinced he was the victim of the greatest heist in California history. He raised the phone to his ear, waiting for the dispatcher to answer. But before his thumb could even press the call button, a calm, authoritative voice echoed from the shadows of the hallway. The illusion was finally over. Put the phone away, Connor. There is no emergency, and there has been no robbery. The voice was smooth-cultured and entirely devoid of fear. Connor froze his thumb, hovering over the glowing screen. From the deep shadows of the hallway leading to the kitchen, a figure emerged. Mr. Harrison stepped into the fading evening light, looking impeccably dressed in his tailored Italian suit. He walked slowly to the center of the living room, casually adjusted the crease of his trousers, and took a seat on the $5 plastic folding chair I had left for him. He crossed one leg over the other, resting a thick manila folder on his knee. Connor lowered his phone, his chest heaving rapidly. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of sudden rage and underlying terror. "How did you get into my house?" Mr. Harrison offered a small, patronizing smile. He did not raise his voice. He simply let the absolute authority of his presence fill the empty, echoing room. "I am Mr. Harrison," he replied calmly. "I am the senior legal counsel for your wife. And to correct your first misconception, this is not your house. It never was." Sienna took a sudden step backward, her eyes darting between Connor and the man in the suit. Connor, however, let his arrogance override his panic. He puffed out his chest and marched toward the center of the room, pointing a trembling finger at the lawyer. "You are trespassing," Connor spat. "I do not care who you are or what kind of stunt my wife thinks she is pulling. Naomi and I do not have a prenuptial agreement. Under California state law, everything acquired during this marriage is community property. I am entitled to exactly 50% of this estate, and I am not leaving until I get it. Now get out of my living room before I have you arrested." Mr. Harrison let out a low, dry laugh that echoed off the bare drywall. It was the sound of a corporate predator cornering its prey. He uncrossed his legs, stood up, and held out the thick manila folder. "I highly suggest you read the documents inside before you make any more embarrassing legal threats," Mr. Harrison said. Connor snatched the folder from his hand. He ripped open the flap and pulled out the crisp, white legal papers. His eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the first page. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "That is an emergency restraining order," Mr. Harrison explained, his tone turning instantly lethal. "It was signed by a Superior Court judge exactly 4 hours ago. It was granted on the grounds of aggravated domestic battery. When you chose to throw a mug of boiling coffee at my client yesterday morning, you handed us the exact physical evidence we needed to permanently remove you from her presence. You are now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Naomi or this property." Connor swallowed hard, his hands shaking so violently that the papers rustled loudly in the quiet room. His eyes dropped to the second document. "And that," Mr. Harrison continued, "is a formal notice of immediate eviction. You see, Connor, you have spent years operating under the delusion that you were a co-owner of this estate. But my client is an exceptionally intelligent woman. She never placed this property in her own name. 5 years ago, before she ever made the mistake of marrying you, she transferred the deed and the entirety of her liquid wealth into an irrevocable corporate trust. She is merely a beneficiary. You cannot claim half of a house your wife does not even legally own. Under the law, you are nothing more than a temporary guest, and your invitation has just been permanently revoked." The document slipped from Connor's hands and scattered across the hardwood floor. The master plan he had so proudly boasted about to his family was entirely dead. There would be no massive payout. There would be no forced sale of the house. He was completely trapped. Sienna let out a sharp gasp. The realization finally hit her. She had not seduced a wealthy tech investor. She had seduced a financially dependent parasite who was currently being evicted from his wife's house. "Sienna, wait," Connor pleaded, turning toward her desperately. "This is just a misunderstanding. We can fight this in court. Fight it with what money? She snapped back, her face twisted in disgust. You could not even buy a steak. You do not own anything. I am not getting dragged into a criminal domestic violence case because you lied to me. She grabbed her purse, turned on her heel, and walked straight out the front door. Mr. Harrison raised his left arm and checked his platinum wristwatch. It is currently 6:15 in the evening, he announced, his voice slicing through Connor's despair. I have 2 squad cars from the local precinct parked just down the street. You have exactly 10 minutes to go upstairs, gather those cheap golf clubs and the few wrinkled shirts my client generously allowed you to keep, and walk out that door. Connor opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed. If you are still standing inside this house at 6:26, Mr. Harrison added, his eyes narrowing into a cold glare, I will wave the police inside. They will arrest you for a criminal violation of a restraining order. You will spend the rest of this weekend sitting in a concrete holding cell. I strongly suggest you start walking. Your time starts now. I watched the live feed on my laptop, fascinated by the complete collapse of the man who had tormented me for years. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed through the large bare windows of the living room, casting harsh shadows against the empty walls. Sienna had not just walked out to her car. The moment she stepped onto the front porch, she had dialed 911. She wanted an official police escort to retrieve her designer overnight bag from the trunk of Connor's leased vehicle, and she wanted it on the record that she had absolutely no part in whatever criminal enterprise she believed he was running. 2 uniformed police officers walked through the open front door, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Sienna followed closely behind them, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my husband. There he is, she told the officers, her voice thick with fake tears. He lured me to this empty house under false pretenses, and now there is some strange man in a suit threatening us. Connor immediately puffed out his chest, attempting to use the arrival of law enforcement to regain control. Officers, thank God you are here, he said, his voice loud and authoritative. I am the owner of this estate. That man sitting on the chair is a trespasser. I want him removed from my property immediately. Mr. Harrison did not even stand up. He simply reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a second copy of the legal documents, and held them out toward the senior officer. Good evening, gentlemen, Mr. Harrison said, his voice the picture of calm professionalism. I am legal counsel for the actual owner of this property. The man yelling at you is currently in criminal violation of an emergency protective order. The senior officer took the documents. He read the first page, his eyes scanning the judge's signature and the bold text of the restraining order. Then he looked at the eviction notice. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The officer looked up, his expression hardening as he turned his attention squarely onto Connor. Sir, the officer said firmly, stepping directly into Connor's personal space. According to this court order, you are legally required to maintain a 500-foot distance from this property. You have exactly 2 minutes to gather whatever personal items this lawyer allows you to take, and then you are leaving the premises. If you argue with me or if you refuse to leave, I will place you in handcuffs and you will spend the weekend in the county jail. Connor opened his mouth to protest, but the officer immediately rested his hand on his handcuffs. It was the universal gesture of law enforcement shutting down a debate. Connor broke. The arrogant executive vanished, replaced by a terrified, sweating man facing the absolute destruction of his reality. He turned and sprinted up the bare wooden stairs, his footsteps echoing loudly. Less than 2 minutes later, he came back down. It was the most pathetic sight I had ever witnessed. He was carrying his cheap set of golf clubs over one shoulder and clutching a haphazard pile of wrinkled dress shirts and golf polos in his arms. He did not even have a suitcase. The officers escorted him out the front door, matching his pace step for step down the long paved driveway. Sienna walked entirely separate from him, pulling her rolling overnight bag behind her. The flashing lights of the police cruisers had done exactly what I hoped they would do. They had drawn an audience. This was Calabasas. The neighbors were high-profile executives and doctors who valued their quiet, exclusive community. I watched through the exterior camera feed as the venture capitalist next door stopped walking his dog, staring openly at the spectacle. The surgeon across the street stood at the end of his driveway with his arms crossed. Everyone was watching Connor, the man who constantly bragged at neighborhood block parties about his massive wealth being marched out of his own home carrying a pile of loose laundry. They reached the sidewalk. The officers instructed Connor to stay exactly where he was and warned him that if he stepped 1 foot back onto the driveway, he would be arrested. A sleek black luxury vehicle pulled up to the curb. Sienna had ordered an Uber Black. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door for her. Connor panicked. He dropped his wrinkled shirts onto the concrete sidewalk and lunged toward the open car door. "Sienna, please," he begged, his voice cracking loudly in the quiet neighborhood. "Just let me ride with you. Let me crash at your apartment for a few days until I can call my mother and get this sorted out. I have nowhere else to go." Sienna paused with 1 foot inside the vehicle. She turned around and looked him up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are a broke, homeless, middle-aged man who just got evicted from his wife's house," she said loudly, ensuring the officers and the watching neighbors heard every single word. "You cannot even afford to split the fare for this ride. Do not ever contact me again." She slid into the back seat and slammed the door shut. The heavy car pulled away from the curb, its red taillights disappearing down the street. The 2 police officers climbed back into their cruisers and slowly drove away, their job complete. I sat in my hotel room and smiled as I watched the final image on my screen. Connor was completely alone, standing on the cold concrete sidewalk under the glow of a street lamp. His golf clubs were slung over his shoulder, his wrinkled clothes were scattered on the ground at his feet, and his wealthy neighbors were staring at him in silent judgment. His pride, his money, and his mistress were all gone. And the best part was, my revenge had only just begun. Connor had nowhere else to go. Left standing on the sidewalk with his golf clubs and a pile of wrinkled laundry, he was forced to endure the ultimate humiliation of calling his mother for a ride. I knew this because Terrence texted me a play-by-play late Sunday night. Connor had arrived at Diane's house in tears, spinning a wild, fabricated tale about how I had suffered a sudden mental breakdown, hired a fake lawyer, and illegally locked him out of his own home. He played the victim flawlessly, omitting every detail about Sienna and the empty bank accounts. Diane, who had spent her entire life coddling his delusions and feeding his ego, believed every single word he said. I did not care what lies he told her to save face. I had a business to run. On Monday morning, I drove to the downtown Los Angeles high-rise, where I leased a private suite for my cybersecurity firm. The building housed several top-tier federal contractors and financial institutions, which meant the security protocols were absolute. You did not just walk into this building without an appointment, a verified identification badge, and clearance from the front desk. I was in the middle of a highly classified video conference with a defense client when the emergency intercom on my desk buzzed loudly. It was the head of lobby security. He apologized for the interruption but informed me there was a woman downstairs causing a severe disturbance. He said she was screaming my name, threatening the reception staff, and demanding I come down immediately to face her. I knew exactly who it was. I muted my microphone calmly, excused myself from the meeting, smoothed the front of my tailored blazer, and picked up a single manila envelope from my desk. I stepped into the glass elevator and rode it down to the ground floor. The scene unfolding in the massive marble lobby was spectacular. Diane was completely unhinged. She was wearing a matching pastel country club outfit, her face flushed dark red with rage, screaming at the top of her lungs. She was pointing furiously at the reception desk, demanding the building managers freeze my company assets. She shouted to anyone who would listen that I was a criminal, a manipulative thief who had stolen her son's $2.5 million house and left him homeless on the street. The morning rush of executives and corporate lawyers had stopped to watch the spectacle. Diane, realizing no one was obeying her commands, tried to force her way past the electronic security turnstiles to reach the elevator banks. 2 massive security guards immediately stepped into her path to block her. When she aggressively shoved one of the guards in the chest, they did not hesitate. They grabbed her arms swiftly, turned her around, and forced her against the polished marble wall, pinning her securely to prevent her from assaulting anyone else. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. The lobby fell dead silent, save for Diane's frantic, heavy panting. I walked slowly across the floor, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the high ceilings. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from her. The security guards held her firmly, looking to me for confirmation. "Let me go," Diane shrieked, struggling violently against the guards. "You ungrateful little gold digger! You think you can steal my son's house? I'm going to have you thrown in federal prison. You are nothing but a street rat who scammed her way into our wealthy family." I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her outfit or her pathetic attempt at intimidation. I simply held out the manila envelope and pulled out the thick stack of papers inside. It was the American Express fraud investigation report. I held the document up right in front of her face so she could clearly read the bold red text at the top of the page. "You are incredibly loud for a woman whose family is currently under active criminal investigation for credit card fraud," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the quiet lobby. "I am not a thief, Diane, but your perfect son is." This is the official banking report detailing how Connor stole my titanium credit card to buy a $4,000 designer handbag for your daughter Brittany. He bought it to bribe her into keeping quiet about the 24-year-old mistress he has been hiding in a downtown penthouse. Diane stopped struggling immediately. Her eyes darted rapidly across the page, landing on the itemized boutique receipts, the exact timestamps, and Connor's forged digital signature. The color drained entirely from her face as the absolute reality of her son's depravity finally hit her. I stepped closer, leaning in so only she could hear my next words. "Connor is completely broke," I whispered coldly. "He has no equity. He has no tech startup. He has been draining my accounts for years to fund his fake lifestyle, and now the tap is dry. If you ever come near my office or my property again, I will not just have you arrested for trespassing. I will hand this entire fraud file over to the local police precinct and have your son and your daughter arrested for grand theft." I nodded to the head of security. The flashing lights of a police cruiser were already visible through the revolving glass doors at the front entrance. The security guards marched Diane out of the building. She did not scream. She did not fight back. She looked completely hollowed out, staring blankly ahead in pure shock, as the police officers met her on the sidewalk to officially ban her from the premises. I turned around, walked back into the glass elevator, and pressed the button for my floor. Diane's pride was entirely broken, but I knew the blast radius of that fraud report was about to hit Brittany next. I walked back into my office and closed the door, my heart steady and my mind completely clear. I knew Diane would immediately call her daughter the second the police released her from the lobby. But Brittany had her own catastrophic problems to deal with that afternoon. The blast radius of my financial lockdown was expanding rapidly, and Terrence called me later that evening to give me the full, highly satisfying debrief of how his own surgical extraction went down. It started with the afternoon mail delivery at their upscale suburban home. Brittany had been lounging by the pool, likely filming content for her social media followers, when she opened a thick, certified letter from American Express. It was a formal notice of an active fraud investigation regarding the $4,000 quilted designer handbag she had so proudly flaunted online. The letter demanded the immediate surrender of the stolen merchandise and included a very stark, very real warning regarding the severe legal consequences of possessing stolen goods across state lines. Brittany panicked. She knew she could not go to jail. A criminal record did not fit her carefully curated Instagram aesthetic. She grabbed the keys to her leased luxury SUV and drove straight to Terrence's veterinary clinic. According to Terrence, she bypassed the crowded waiting room entirely, ignoring the receptionist as she marched right into his private back office. She slammed the heavy wooden door behind her, marched up to his desk, and threw the certified letter directly over his open laptop. "You need to write a check to the credit card company right now," she demanded, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Naomi is completely out of her mind. She is trying to have me arrested over a stupid gift Connor gave me. You need to pay the $4,000 and make this go away before the police show up at our house and ruin my reputation." Terrence was in the middle of reviewing a patient chart. He calmly capped his pen, folded his hands together on his desk, and looked up at his wife. For years, he had endured her endless spending habits. He had worked grueling 12-hour shifts saving animals just to watch her drain his hard-earned profits on fake designer clothes and expensive lunches with women who secretly despised her. He had bitten his tongue every time her family made a condescending remark about him being just a pet doctor. He was finally done. Terrence opened his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it directly on top of the American Express fraud notice. It was not a corporate checkbook. It was a formal petition for dissolution of marriage. Brittany stared at the bold legal header printed on the first page. "What is this?" she asked, her voice suddenly trembling as the aggressive energy drained right out of her. "It is exactly what it looks like," Terrence replied, his voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "I am divorcing you, Brittany. And I am absolutely not paying a single cent to cover the stolen bag your brother bought you. I know everything." Brittany took a step back, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, attempting to play the victim one last time. "I know about the 24-year-old girl Connor has been hiding in a downtown penthouse," Terrence said, his tone turning ice cold. "I know he used Naomi's money to buy your silence. I know you sat at my dinner table spending my money while actively helping your brother plot to destroy his wife. You are a toxic, entitled liability, and I am cutting you off." Brittany immediately started crying, offering desperate excuses about family loyalty and how Connor just needed someone to talk to. She begged Terrence to protect her, reminding him that she was his wife, and he had a legal obligation to support her. Terrence stood up from his desk. "I do not have to protect a criminal," he said firmly. "And I certainly do not have to fund one. Before you walked into this office today, I spent 3 hours at the bank with my business attorney. You are officially removed as an authorized user on every single account tied to this veterinary practice. Your company credit cards are canceled. Our joint checking account is frozen, and the funds have been transferred to an escrow account pending the divorce settlement. The only money you have access to right now is whatever you earn yourself, which we both know is absolutely nothing." Brittany reached into her designer purse with shaking hands and pulled out the platinum corporate card she used to fund her daily shopping sprees. She stared at it as if she had just realized it was nothing more than a useless piece of plastic. Her entire fake rich lifestyle had just been shattered in a single afternoon. "I suggest you hand that stolen bag over to the police the second they knock on your door," Terrence added as he walked over to open his office door, signaling for her to leave. "Because if you try to hide it, you will be facing felony charges completely alone. I cannot afford to have a criminal living in my house. You have until the end of the weekend to pack your things and move back in with your mother." Brittany stumbled out of the clinic, weeping uncontrollably in front of a waiting room full of clients. She had walked in demanding a $4,000 bailout, and she walked out with divorce papers, zero access to cash, and an impending police investigation. The parasites were finally being stripped of their hosts, and the absolute panic setting in among them was entirely their own doing. Tuesday morning arrived with a completely different kind of warfare. I was sitting in my downtown office, reviewing a complex security patch for a federal database, when my personal cell phone began vibrating continuously. It was not a steady, normal ring. It was a frantic, relentless buzzing. Notifications were flooding my screen from Facebook, LinkedIn, and mutual acquaintances I had not spoken to in several years. I opened the first text message from an old college friend. It simply read, "Naomi, what is going on? I am so sorry to read about this." I opened my LinkedIn application. Right at the top of my professional feed was a massive multi-paragraph post from Connor. He had spent the night stewing in his mother's guest room, entirely stripped of his wealth and his mistress. And he had decided to go nuclear. If he could not have my money, he was going to destroy my ability to make it. I read through his manifesto. It was a masterclass in gaslighting and narcissistic victimhood. Connor claimed that he had been suffering in silence for years, under the weight of my severe emotional and physical abuse. He completely reversed the narrative of the coffee incident, stating that I had violently attacked him in a manic rage and illegally locked him out of his own home to cover my tracks. He described himself as a devoted, loving husband who had sacrificed his own career to support my business, only to be thrown out onto the street with nothing but the wrinkled clothes on his back. But the domestic abuse allegations were not the most dangerous part of his post. Connor knew exactly how sensitive my industry was. He wrote a highly detailed paragraph accusing me of corporate embezzlement. He claimed I was using complex, offshore accounts to hide stolen funds from my federal clients and the Internal Revenue Service. In the world of cybersecurity and defense contracting, trust is the absolute only currency that matters. An accusation of financial fraud is an instant career death sentence. The post was gaining traction at a terrifying speed. Mutual friends from our country club days were flooding the comment section with messages of support for Connor. They called me a sociopath. They praised his bravery for speaking out against female perpetrators of domestic violence. Connor was playing the wounded martyr, perfectly soaking up the digital sympathy while actively trying to burn my empire to the ground. He had even tagged my primary business profile and several prominent cybersecurity groups in Los Angeles to ensure maximum visibility. Then my encrypted work line rang. It was not a concerned friend. It was the Chief Information Security Officer for one of my largest defense clients. Federal agencies utilize automated sentiment tracking software to monitor the public profiles of their cleared contractors. Connor's post had triggered an automatic high-priority security alert within their system. I answered the call. The executive on the other end was not angry, but his tone was strictly procedural and incredibly tense. He informed me that due to the highly public allegations of financial misconduct, their legal department was requiring an immediate suspension of my network access, pending a full internal review. He told me that if there was even a fraction of truth to the embezzlement claims, they would be forced to terminate my contract immediately and report my firm to federal authorities. Less than 5 minutes later, a second client called. This time, it was a vice president at a major financial institution. She expressed deep concern over the domestic violence allegations, stating that their company had a strict morality clause for all external vendors. She asked me for a formal written explanation by the end of the business day. The tension in my office spiked sharply. Connor had finally managed to strike a nerve. He could not touch my bank accounts, and he could not enter my home, but he was actively poisoning my professional reputation. He was weaponizing the very networks I spent my life protecting. My income, my federal security clearance, and my entire professional identity were suddenly hanging by a very thin thread. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my heavy leather chair. A lesser woman might have rushed to social media to post a frantic defense, begging people to believe her side of the story. She might have called Connor crying and negotiating, offering him a financial settlement to take the post down. But I knew that engaging in a public mudslinging contest was exactly what he wanted. He wanted me to look erratic, emotional, and desperate. He wanted to drag me down into the mud so he could leverage my panic during the divorce proceedings. I watched the view count on Connor's post climb higher and higher. Every like and share was another crack in the foundation of my business. He really believed he had backed me into a corner. He thought his lies would force me to surrender my assets just to save my reputation. I did not type a single comment. I did not issue a public statement. Instead, I opened a secure messaging channel and contacted Terrence. I told him Connor had just launched a massive public smear campaign, and my corporate contracts were officially at risk. I needed to shut Connor down permanently, and I needed to do it in a way that would completely exonerate me in the eyes of my clients and the public. Terrence replied less than a minute later. He told me not to worry. He had the perfect weapon ready to deploy, and it was going to expose Connor to the entire internet in a way he could never possibly recover from. I sat at my desk, my eyes glued to the glowing monitor, watching the view count on Connor's fabricated post climb higher and higher. I did not have to wait long. Less than 3 minutes after I spoke with Terrence, a new notification popped up on my screen. Terrence had just left a comment on Connor's post. He did not write a long, emotional defense. He did not engage in a messy digital argument. He simply dropped a single audio file and tagged Connor's exact employer, a mid-sized medical device sales firm, along with their regional sales director and the official corporate human resources page. Terrence added a caption that was a masterpiece of cold, clinical precision. He wrote, "For anyone concerned about Connor's sudden homelessness and his allegations of abuse, please listen to this raw audio from our family barbecue last month. Listen to him brag about planning to blindside his wife with a divorce, force the sale of her premarital home, and use her money to fund a luxury apartment for his 24-year-old mistress, Sienna. As a bonus, listen to his mother and sister cheer him on while he plots his financial crimes." Then the audio nuke detonated. I watched the interaction metrics on the post freeze for a moment and then completely explode. The crystal-clear recording of Connor drunkenly laughing about stealing my money and trading me in for a younger model echoed across the internet. The very people who had been praising his bravery and offering him a place to stay just 10 minutes earlier were now listening to him expose his own predatory, deceitful nature in his own voice. The comment section flipped with a speed that was breathtaking to witness. The sympathetic messages were rapidly replaced by shock, outrage, and absolute disgust. Mutual friends from our country club days began tagging their spouses publicly, demanding Connor be permanently removed from their social circles. The women who had just called me a sociopath were now deleting their comments and publicly dragging Connor for his manipulative lies. Connor panicked. I watched his profile go offline as he frantically tried to delete the entire post to hide the evidence, but the internet is forever. Terrence had already taken screenshots and reposted the audio to every single mutual group page they shared. But the social media backlash was nothing compared to the corporate execution that followed. Connor was a sales manager. His entire livelihood depended on his public image, his charisma, and his ability to maintain absolute trust with his clients. Terrence had directly tagged the executives at Connor's firm, and in the modern corporate world, a viral public post detailing extreme financial abuse, infidelity, and premeditated theft is a radioactive liability. It took exactly 47 minutes for the hammer to fall. Terrence sent me a text message containing a screenshot he received from a mutual friend who worked in Connor's office. The regional director had marched directly into the human resources department the second the audio started circulating among the sales team. They did not even wait for Connor to come into the office to defend himself. They called him on his cell phone while he was sitting in his mother's guest bedroom. They informed him that his highly public posts, coupled with the indisputable audio evidence of his predatory behavior, were a direct and egregious violation of the company's morality clause and professional code of conduct. He was terminated immediately, effectively ending his career with a single phone call. He was permanently stripped of his salary, his pending quarterly commissions, and his corporate health benefits. The company immediately locked him out of his work email, remotely wiped all the data from his company-issued cell phone, and deactivated his corporate expense accounts. They completely severed all ties, treating him like a toxic asset that needed to be instantly liquidated. I took a screenshot of the entire thread, including the audio file and the subsequent fallout, and compiled it into a clean professional digital dossier. I forwarded the package directly to the Chief Information Security Officer and the bank executive who had called me earlier that morning. I added a brief professional note explaining that I was the victim of a coordinated extortion attempt by my estranged husband, and that his public allegations were completely fabricated as an act of retaliation for cutting off his access to my finances. Both clients responded within the hour. My security access was fully reinstated, and the internal corporate investigations against me were immediately dropped. The bank executive even sent a personal follow-up email commending my absolute professionalism and grace under such extreme public duress. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and took a deep breath, feeling the tension finally leave my shoulders. My empire was entirely secure. Connor, on the other hand, had just lost his final lifeline. He had no house, he had no mistress, he had no access to my credit cards, and now he had absolutely no income. He was a 35-year-old man with a ruined public reputation and zero prospects. He had tried to bury me, but all he had done was dig his own grave perfectly to scale. The total loss of his corporate income was the final catalyst for his complete unraveling. Connor was sitting in his childhood bedroom at his mother's house, entirely devoid of options and rapidly running out of time. His phone, the only device he had left after his company wiped and confiscated his work electronics, was blowing up with furious text messages from Sienna. The 24-year-old sugar baby was not interested in a disgraced unemployed man living with his mother. She sent him a final ultimatum demanding he produce the wealth he had promised her by the end of the week, or she was blocking his number permanently and moving on to her next wealthy target. Connor was cornered. His ego simply could not process the reality of his failure. He needed a massive influx of cash right away, and he was arrogant enough to believe he could outsmart a professional cybersecurity consultant to get it. I knew exactly what his next move would be because I watched him execute it in real time. Sitting comfortably in my secure downtown office, an automated silent alarm flashed bright red across my secondary monitor. An unauthorized external IP address was attempting to breach a legacy server portal I maintained. I ran a quick geographical trace on the incoming connection. It was pinging from a public library computer terminal just 3 miles away from Diane's house. Years ago, during the second year of our marriage, Connor had developed a paranoid obsession that I was hiding vast sums of marital money from him. While I was out of town on a business trip, he had secretly installed a crude remote access backdoor Trojan onto an old backup laptop I kept in my home office. He thought he was an absolute genius for pulling it off. He had no idea that my network monitoring software had detected his amateur spyware program exactly 48 hours after he installed it. I never deleted his little backdoor. Instead, I carefully isolated it. I quarantined that specific laptop from my primary network and transformed it into a digital honeypot. In cybersecurity terms, a honeypot is a decoy system designed specifically to lure in attackers. It looks completely vulnerable and contains highly attractive fake data, but it is entirely contained, allowing me to monitor every single move the intruder makes. Through my intrusion detection dashboard, I watched every single keystroke Connor typed on that sticky public library keyboard. He logged into the remote portal using his old backdoor password. I could almost picture him sitting in the quiet library, sweating profusely, looking over his shoulder, while he thought he was executing the perfect cyber heist. He immediately started digging through the dummy directories I had deliberately populated with realistic-looking financial documents. He was desperately searching for offshore accounts, hidden stock portfolios, or anything he could claim was community property. He clicked through folder after folder, his digital footprint heavy and entirely unmasked. Then he found exactly what I wanted him to find. I watched his cursor hover over a secured ledger file labeled as an unrestricted corporate reserve fund. He double-clicked the file. The screen populated with a highly official-looking banking statement showing an available liquid balance of $250,000. I knew his heart must have been pounding out of his chest. In his desperate, entirely unqualified mind, he had just uncovered the ultimate proof of my financial deception. He believed he had found my hidden marital savings, and he felt completely justified in taking every single cent of it. He did not pause to question why a federal security consultant would leave $250,000 sitting in an easily accessible folder. His greed completely blinded his logic. Now he had to extract the money. He could not wire the funds to his own bank accounts because I had already frozen them. He needed a secure, untouchable location. He remembered a conversation he had with Sienna weeks ago, back when he was pretending to be a high-rolling angel investor. Sienna had given him the international routing numbers for a specific offshore shell account in the Cayman Islands. She claimed she used it to hide her sugar baby income from the Internal Revenue Service. Connor believed that if he wired the $250,000 directly into Sienna's offshore account, he would secure his future, prove his immense wealth, and win back the young mistress who was threatening to abandon him. I watched the live screen capture as he opened the wire transfer portal. His typing was frantic. He inputted the Cayman Islands routing numbers, verified the recipient name, and typed in the exact amount of $250,000. He bypassed the fake security protocols I had intentionally lowered for him. He clicked the final submit button. The screen flashed green, displaying a massive confirmation message that the funds had been successfully transferred out of the account. Connor logged out of the portal, likely leaning back in his plastic library chair, with a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He actually believed he had won the war. He thought he had stolen his wealth back and secured a luxurious new life on an island. He had absolutely no idea that he had just stepped completely past a civil family dispute and walked straight into a catastrophic federal crime. The green confirmation screen glowed brightly on my monitor, casting a pale light across my dark office. I sat back and watched the digital trace finalize. The $250,000 had officially left the decoy network and vanished into the international wire system, heading straight for the Cayman Islands shell account Sienna had provided him. Connor had actually done it. He had crossed the line from a bitter, entitled ex-husband into a documented cyber criminal. I quickly downloaded the complete data packet capturing his IP address, the exact timestamps, the keystroke logs, and the destination routing numbers. The digital evidence was absolutely airtight. Less than 5 minutes later, my encrypted work line buzzed with an incoming message from Terrence. He was parked in his truck outside his veterinary clinic, but he had just received a frantic, joyful phone call from Brittany. Terrence transcribed the entire conversation for me. Connor had just marched downstairs into Diane's kitchen, completely euphoric. He was shouting at the top of his lungs, slamming his hands on the counter in pure triumph. He told his mother and his sister that he had just successfully hacked into my hidden offshore accounts. He bragged that he had outsmarted my security systems and legally taken back what was rightfully his. He proudly announced that he had secured $250,000 in liquid cash, completely untraceable, and securely hidden out of my reach. According to Terrence, the parasites were throwing an absolute celebration in the kitchen. Diane was crying tears of joy, praising Connor for being so brilliant and taking back his power from a manipulative woman. Brittany was practically screaming through the phone to Terrence, demanding he rip up the divorce papers because her brother was now rich enough to bail her out. Connor was handing out promises like a lottery winner. He promised to pay off the $4,000 American Express fraud charge to keep Brittany out of jail. He promised to buy Diane a luxury car to make up for the stress I had caused her. He was completely high on his own delusion, acting like the savior of the family. He genuinely believed he had won the war. I read Terrence's text messages and let out a soft, genuine laugh. Connor thought he had outsmarted a top-tier cybersecurity consultant using a public library computer and a 5-year-old password. He thought the money was his ticket back to Sienna and a life of luxury. He had absolutely no idea that the Cayman Islands account did not belong to Sienna, but to a professional scam ring. And worse, he had no idea what kind of money he had actually just stolen. My personal cell phone suddenly chimed. It was the official banking alert pinging my primary device, notifying me that a massive wire transfer had just been initiated from the corporate reserve account. A normal person would have panicked watching $250,000 drain from their ledger. They would have immediately called their bank, screaming and begging them to reverse the international wire before it cleared. I did not panic. I simply smiled, reached across my desk, and picked up my encrypted phone. I bypassed my standard contacts and dialed a direct 10-digit number I had memorized years ago. It was a restricted federal line for the Cybercrimes Division. The phone rang twice before a deep professional voice answered. Agent Davis speaking. Good afternoon, Agent Davis, I said, keeping my tone perfectly calm and measured. This is Naomi. I am calling to report a confirmed successful breach on my secondary honeypot server. There was a brief pause on the line as the agent pulled up my contractor file. Go ahead, Naomi. What are we looking at? Exactly 12 minutes ago, an unauthorized external user breached the secure portal using a legacy backdoor Trojan, I explained. The user initiated a direct wire transfer of $250,000 into an offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. I have the complete intrusion logs, the destination routing numbers, and the exact physical location of the public IP address used to execute the hack. Do we have a positive identification on the intruder? Agent Davis asked, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background. Yes, I replied smoothly. The intruder is my estranged husband, Connor. He believes he just stole my personal marital savings. He is an idiot, Agent Davis stated bluntly. That decoy account is directly linked to the segregated federal project funds for the Department of Defense contract. He just committed federal wire fraud and the theft of government property. I know, I replied, staring out the window at the Los Angeles skyline. I am forwarding the complete data packet to your encrypted server now. He has a mandatory divorce mediation scheduled for tomorrow morning at my attorney's office. He will be sitting right across the table from me, completely unaware of what he has done. Understood, Agent Davis said, his voice hardening into official law enforcement protocol. We will have a federal warrant signed by a judge before midnight. We will see you tomorrow morning, Naomi. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop. Connor was currently celebrating in his mother's kitchen, making grand promises with money that belonged to the United States government. He thought he was untouchable. He was about to find out exactly how heavy the hand of federal law could be. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Mr. Harrison's Century City conference room. I sat perfectly still at the long mahogany table, my hands folded neatly in front of me. Mr. Harrison sat to my right, organizing a stack of pristine legal folders. Across from us sat the court-appointed mediator, a retired judge named Mr. Caldwell, who was reviewing the preliminary filings. We were waiting for Connor. He arrived exactly 15 minutes late. It was a classic transparent power play designed to show us that he was in control of the timeline. The heavy glass door swung open, and Connor marched into the room. The visual contrast was almost comical. Without access to his expensive dry cleaners or his high-end wardrobe, he was forced to wear one of the cheap, off-the-rack suits he had hastily grabbed during his eviction. It was wrinkled at the elbows and fit him poorly across the shoulders. But despite his disheveled appearance, he carried himself with the absolute arrogance of a man who believed he held a winning lottery ticket in his pocket. He did not bring a lawyer. He pulled out a leather chair opposite me and sat down heavily, crossing his arms and flashing a smug, triumphant smile in my direction. He looked completely unbothered by the fact that he was unemployed, homeless, and facing a criminal restraining order. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and officially opened the mandatory mediation session. He explained that the goal today was to find an equitable dissolution of the marriage without enduring the financial drain of a prolonged court battle. He barely finished his introductory sentence before Connor raised his hand, cutting the retired judge off completely. "We do not need to waste time with opening statements," Connor declared, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the polished wood. "I know exactly what I want, and I know exactly what I am legally entitled to. Since my wife decided to illegally lock me out of my own home and orchestrate a campaign to get me fired from my job, I am going to make this very simple for her." Mr. Harrison did not look up from his notepad. He simply clicked his pen and asked Connor to state his terms. "I want $10,000 a month in permanent spousal support," Connor demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet conference room. "I also want a one-time payout of $50,000 to cover the emotional distress and the relocation fees she forced upon me. And I want the restraining order dropped today. If she agrees to wire the funds by tomorrow morning, I will sign the divorce papers and walk away cleanly." Mr. Caldwell frowned, adjusting his reading glasses. He reminded Connor that spousal support in California requires a thorough review of both parties' financial disclosures, which Connor had entirely failed to provide. Connor simply waved his hand dismissively, acting as though the established laws of the state were beneath him. I stared at him, my expression completely blank. He was attempting to extort me while sitting in a room with two seasoned legal professionals. "And what exactly is your alternative proposal, Mr. Harrison asked, his voice dripping with dry amusement. "Suppose my client declines to pay you a single cent. What is your strategy then, Connor?" Connor leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head. The smugness radiating off him was palpable. "Then I will drag this divorce out for the next 5 years," he replied confidently. "I will refuse to sign anything. I will file endless motions. I will demand a full forensic accounting of her business. I will make sure she spends hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees just trying to get rid of me. I have nothing but time." He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "You think you ruined me, Naomi?" he sneered. "You think cutting off my credit cards and getting me fired was a death blow? But you really underestimated me. I am much smarter than you give me credit for. I do not actually need your $10,000 a month to survive. I have already secured my future. I just want your money now to punish you. You think you can just hide your wealth from me?" Connor added, lowering his voice into a mocking whisper. "You think I do not know about the little corporate reserve accounts you try to keep off the books? I know everything, Naomi. I am 10 steps ahead of you." I knew exactly what he meant by securing his future. He was indirectly bragging about the $250,000 he had stolen the night before. He truly believed that money was sitting safely in a Cayman Islands account, waiting for him to fly down to the Caribbean and reunite with his mistress. He felt completely invincible. "Are you quite finished?" Mr. Harrison asked, finally looking up from his legal pad to meet Connor's arrogant gaze. Connor smirked and uncrossed his arms. "I am finished. The offer is on the table. Take it or prepare for years of absolute misery. The choice is yours." Mr. Caldwell looked over at our side of the table, clearly expecting Mr. Harrison to begin the standard negotiation process. He expected us to counter-offer to argue about the length of the marriage or to dispute the absurd spousal support calculations. Instead, I simply reached out and placed my hand flat on the mahogany table. I looked directly into Connor's eyes. "You did not secure your future, Connor," I said softly, my voice perfectly calm. "You completely destroyed it." I kept my hand flat on the table for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until Connor's smug smile began to falter. He shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable under the collective gaze of myself, Mr. Harrison, and the mediator. Without breaking eye contact, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thin blue folder. I slid it slowly across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped right in front of him. "Open it," I said. Connor scoffed, but his curiosity won out. He flipped the folder open. Inside was a comprehensive background dossier I had compiled the night before. The first page featured a high-resolution photograph of his precious 24-year-old mistress, Sienna. But the name printed beneath the photo was not Sienna. It was a completely different legal name, accompanied by a lengthy criminal record spanning 3 different states. "What is this?" Connor asked, his brow furrowing as he scanned the first page. "Is this supposed to scare me? You ran a background check on my girlfriend." "That is pathetic. She is not your girlfriend, Connor," I replied, keeping my tone analytical and cold. "She is a professional scam artist, and you are just her latest mark." Connor let out a nervous, dismissive laugh. "You are lying. You are just jealous because she is younger and actually respects me." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. Sienna targets insecure middle management men who want to play the role of a wealthy sugar daddy, but lack the actual capital to sustain it. She feeds your ego, convinces you to lease expensive cars, and pushes you to buy luxury apartments. But she never actually signs her own name to the debt. She leaves you holding the bag, and when the money runs out, she vanishes. Connor swallowed hard, his eyes darting rapidly across the rap sheet in the folder. It documented multiple civil suits for fraud and grand larceny. He looked up, his face pale. "This proves nothing," he stammered. "I know her. She loves me. And we have our own money now." "You mean the $250,000 you wired to a Cayman Islands account last night from a public library computer?" I asked softly. Connor flinched violently. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. His breathing hitched. "Mr. Caldwell," the mediator, slowly took off his reading glasses, his expression shifting from neutral professional to deep alarm. Mr. Harrison simply continued writing on his legal pad, meticulously documenting every single word of Connor's implicit confession. "You could not possibly know about that," Connor whispered, his voice cracking with pure terror. "That was an encrypted offshore account. It was untraceable." "Nothing on my network is untraceable, Connor. You used a backdoor password I flagged 5 years ago. I watched you type every single number. But here's the part you really need to understand. That Cayman Islands account does not belong to Sienna. It belongs to a registered shell company operated by her and her actual boyfriend. They have been running this specific wire fraud scheme together for 4 years. Connor stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He shook his head back and forth in rapid denial. No, that is impossible. She gave me the routing numbers herself. She told me it was a secure safe haven for us. She gave you the routing numbers because she knew you were dumb enough to steal from your own wife, I corrected him. She used you, Connor. She realized on Friday night that you were completely broke. She knew you were getting evicted and had absolutely nothing left to offer her. So she manipulated your bruised ego. She convinced you to steal $250,000 and hand-deliver it directly into her personal bank account. I watched his psychological reality completely shatter. The sheer gravity of what he had done crashed down on him all at once. He lunged for his pockets and pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it on the floor. He desperately dialed Sienna's number, pressing the phone hard against his ear. We all sat in silence, listening to the faint robotic voice of the automated carrier message leaking from his phone speaker. The number you have dialed is disconnected or no longer in service. Connor dropped the phone onto the table. It clattered loudly against the wood. She is gone, Connor, I told him, delivering the crushing blow. According to the flight manifests I pulled this morning, Sienna and her boyfriend boarded a first-class flight to Dubai at 6 a.m. They are currently over the Atlantic Ocean drinking champagne paid for with the money you stole. They are never coming back. And you are never seeing a single cent of that cash again. Connor collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands. He let out a ragged, guttural sob that echoed pathetically through the professional conference room. His grand master plan had evaporated. His young mistress had played him for an absolute fool. He had alienated his family, lost his job, lost his home, and handed his only remaining leverage over to a seasoned criminal. He was 35 years old, completely penniless and sobbing in a cheap suit. He had hit rock bottom. But as he sat there crying over his stolen pride and his empty bank accounts, he had absolutely no idea that the money he gave away did not actually belong to me. The true nightmare was waiting right outside the conference room doors. Connor wiped his face with the back of his hand, his breathing ragged and uneven. He sat up straight, desperately, trying to assemble the shattered pieces of his ego. The tears stopped, replaced by a frantic, cornered aggression. He looked at me, his eyes red and wild, and tried to fall back on the only tactic he knew: intimidation. I will just get it back, he stammered, his voice lacking any real conviction, but dripping with desperation. I will go back to the public library today. I still have the backdoor access to your network. If she stole that money, fine. I will just log back in and drain the rest of your accounts. I will take every single cent you have left until I replace what she took and get my life back on track. You cannot stop me, Naomi. I am already inside your system, Mr. Caldwell. The mediator looked absolutely horrified. He raised his hands, preparing to officially terminate the session due to the active confession of a serious financial crime. But before the retired judge could speak, I leaned forward, resting my arms firmly on the polished mahogany table. You did not hack my personal savings, Connor, I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register. He blinked, his face twisting in genuine confusion. What are you talking about? I saw the ledger. I saw the $250,000. I transferred it myself. You saw a decoy, I explained, enunciating every word with perfect clarity. For years you mocked my career. You told your friends I was just a glorified computer nerd sitting in my pajamas while you were out making real business deals. You never actually bothered to understand what I do for a living. I do not just fix firewalls for local businesses, Connor. I am a prime cybersecurity contractor. My primary client is the United States Department of Defense. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy. Mr. Caldwell slowly pushed his chair back from the table, recognizing the catastrophic legal territory we had just entered. Connor stared at me, the confusion slowly morphing into a cold, paralyzing dread. That old backup laptop you infected with your amateur spyware 5 years ago was instantly quarantined. I continued, refusing to break eye contact. I turned it into a digital honeypot. In my industry, a honeypot is a trap designed specifically to lure in hostile actors. I populated it with fake financial documents to see what you would do. But the money you wired last night was not fake, because in order to make the honeypot look legitimate to foreign hackers, it was funded with a real segregated federal project grant. Connor stopped breathing. He looked at Mr. Harrison, searching for some sign that this was a bluff, a legal scare tactic designed to force him into a divorce settlement. But Mr. Harrison was calmly packing his expensive pen away, his face entirely grim and serious. "You did not steal from your wife, Connor," I said, delivering the ultimate drop. "You bypassed a monitored security gateway and wired $250,000 of taxpayer money to an international shell company. You did not commit marital theft. You committed federal wire fraud, cyber espionage, and the theft of government property. You stole from the United States government." "No." Connor whispered, his voice entirely hollow. "No. You are making this up to scare me. It was our money. It was community property. I am your husband. The federal government does not recognize community property when it comes to classified defense budgets," I replied coldly. "The moment you hit submit on that transfer, the automated security protocols flagged your exact location, your keystrokes, and your IP address. I was on the phone with the Cybercrimes Division before you even finished bragging to your mother about how rich you were." Connor gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. His mind was desperately trying to process the sheer magnitude of his mistake. He had traded a comfortable life in a $2.5 million estate for a guaranteed federal prison sentence, all because his fragile ego could not handle being denied a credit card. Mr. Caldwell stood up abruptly, gathering his files with shaking hands. "As an officer of the court, I am formally terminating this mediation," he announced, his voice tight with anxiety. "I cannot preside over a civil dispute involving an active federal crime investigation." Connor jumped out of his chair. He looked toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room, his instincts screaming at him to run. He took one step toward the exit, his eyes darting frantically around the room, but there was nowhere to run. The illusion of his cleverness had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard reality of federal law. He had thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was nothing more than a rat caught in a trap he had set for himself. Before Connor could even extend his trembling hand to grasp the stainless steel handle, the heavy glass doors of the conference room were violently shoved open from the outside. The thick glass hit the rubber doorstop with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot. Connor stumbled backward, his eyes wide with absolute panic. 3 massive men surged into the room. They were not local police officers responding to a civil disturbance. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized, tactical precision that only comes from years of federal law enforcement training. They wore dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their chests and backs. Connor let out a high-pitched shriek as the lead agent lunged forward. The agent grabbed Connor by the collar of his cheap, wrinkled suit and spun him around with effortless brute strength. Connor tried to pull away, a pathetic, reflexive flailing of his arms, which was the absolute worst mistake he could have made. The second agent immediately stepped in, grabbed Connor by the wrist, and swept his leg forward. They slammed my husband's chest first onto the polished mahogany conference table. The impact was incredibly violent. The heavy wood shuddered beneath his weight, sending Mr. Harrison's meticulously organized legal files sliding across the surface and knocking over 2 crystal water glasses. "Mr. Caldwell." The retired judge let out a sharp gasp and pressed his back flat against the far wall, his hands raised in the air to signal he was not a threat. Mr. Harrison simply leaned back in his leather chair, casually pulling his expensive briefcase onto his lap so it would not be damaged by Connor's sprawling, struggling body. Connor gasped for air, his cheek pressed forcefully against the wet mahogany wood. The lead agent, whom I immediately recognized as Agent Davis from his deep, authoritative voice, drove his knee squarely into the small of Connor's back to completely immobilize him. Agent Davis pulled a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The sharp metallic click of the ratchets locking around Connor's wrists sounded incredibly loud in the stunned silence of the room. Connor Agent Davis barked his voice, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. What are you doing? Connor screamed, his voice cracking as he violently thrashed his head side to side. You have the wrong person. I did not do anything. Agent Davis ignored his protests and continued reading the Miranda rights with practiced efficiency while the second agent began patting down Connor's pockets, extracting his cell phone and slipping it into an anti-static evidence bag. You are being charged with 3 counts of federal wire fraud, 1 count of cyber espionage, and the grand theft of government property, Agent Davis stated clearly, leaning down so his voice was right next to Connor's ear. We have a federal warrant for your arrest, and a separate tactical team is currently executing a search warrant on your mother's residence to secure the device you used to access the restricted network. The mention of his mother's house being raided by federal agents was the final psychological blow. Connor completely broke. The remaining shreds of his adult dignity vanished. He began to cry, hysterically sobbing so hard that his entire body shook against the table. Tears and saliva smeared across the polished wood. He twisted his neck painfully, straining his eyes to look at me. I was still sitting calmly in my chair, watching the entire spectacle unfold. Naomi, please, he wailed, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Please tell them it is a mistake. Tell them it was our money. Tell them we are married and this is just a messy divorce dispute. I will sign whatever you want. I will drop the spousal support. I will never bother you again. Just tell them to let me go. You are my wife. Please save me. He was begging for his life. The man who had thrown boiling coffee at my chest, who had stolen my money to fund a younger mistress, and who had spent the last week actively trying to destroy my professional reputation, was now crying like a frightened child, begging me to shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my tailored skirt, picked up my leather tote bag and slung it over my shoulder. I walked around the edge of the conference table, stopping right next to where his face was pinned against the wood. I looked down into his red, terrified eyes. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I do not negotiate with terrorists, Connor, I said coldly. I turned my gaze to the lead agent. Thank you for your swift response, Agent Davis. My legal counsel will forward any additional documentation your team requires. Agent Davis gave me a brief professional nod. We will take it from here, Naomi. I did not look back. I turned around and walked out of the glass doors, leaving the frantic, sobbing screams of my husband echoing behind me. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and felt a profound, incredible weight lift off my shoulders. The parasites were finally completely eradicated. The heavy Los Angeles rain was battering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate office, mirroring the absolute storm that had just decimated my former family. It was late Friday afternoon, exactly 2 days after Connor was dragged out of the mediation room in federal handcuffs. I was sitting at my desk finalizing the security protocols for a new defense contract when the intercom buzzed. It was the head of lobby security again. He sounded almost apologetic. He told me that Diane was back, but this time she had brought Brittany with her. He said they were not screaming or throwing a tantrum like before. He said they were crying uncontrollably and refusing to leave until I came down. I locked my computer screen, took a slow, steadying breath, and rode the glass elevator down to the ground floor. When the doors parted, the sight that greeted me was almost unrecognizable. The 2 women standing near the security turnstiles were completely stripped of their usual arrogant country club aura. They looked completely destroyed. They had clearly walked through the pouring rain from the parking garage. Diane's perfectly styled hair was plastered flat against her skull, and her expensive pastel coat was soaked and heavy. Brittany looked even worse. Her fake designer makeup was running down her cheeks in dark streaks, and she was clutching her wet purse like a lifeline. The moment they saw me walking across the polished marble floor, Diane broke away from the security guards and rushed toward me. The guards immediately stepped in, but I held up my hand to stop them. I wanted to hear exactly what desperation sounded like. Naomi, please. Diane sobbed, her voice echoing pitifully in the cavernous lobby. You have to stop this. You have to call the federal agents and tell them you made a mistake. You have to drop the charges against my son. I stopped a few feet away from her, my expression completely blank. I do not have the power to drop federal charges, Diane. I replied smoothly. Connor did not steal from my personal bank account. He stole classified project funds from the United States government. The FBI does not care about our marital disputes. He is the property of the Justice Department now. Diane let out a choked, ragged wail. She grabbed the wet sleeves of her coat, physically shaking. They set his bail at $1 million, she cried, the absolute panic radiating from every word. $1 million, Naomi. He is sitting in a maximum security holding facility and I cannot get him out. I had to put a second mortgage on my house just to afford the retainer fee for a federal defense lawyer. The bank is going to take my home. I am drowning in debt because of this. You have to give us the money to bail him out. You owe him that much after everything you have put him through. I actually smiled at the sheer, unbroken delusion. I owe him nothing, I said softly. Brittany stepped forward, her shoulders shaking violently. She did not have the energy to act superior anymore. She looked like a frightened child. Naomi, please help us, she begged, her voice cracking. Terrence froze all of my accounts. He is throwing me out of the house. The credit card companies are preparing to sue me for the designer bag Connor bought me, and I have absolutely no way to pay for a lawyer. I am facing total bankruptcy. I have nothing left. Then you should go find a job, Brittany. I replied, my tone turning to absolute ice. The reality of my coldness finally shattered their last remaining ounce of pride. Right there in the middle of the corporate lobby with executives and security guards watching Diane and Brittany drop to their knees. They literally knelt on the hard marble floor at my feet, weeping hysterically, begging for mercy. We are your family, Diane pleaded, looking up at me with desperate red eyes. You cannot just abandon us like this. We are family. I looked down at the two women who had spent years treating me like a disposable bank account. You are not my family, I stated clearly, ensuring my voice carried across the silent lobby. You are parasites. You sat at a barbecue drinking beer and laughing while your son plotted to steal my home. You gladly accepted stolen gifts funded by my hard work. You cheered him on while he leased a luxury penthouse for a 24-year-old girl. You loved my money, but you absolutely despised me. I took a step back, completely distancing myself from their misery. The host organism has officially died, I told them. You are going to have to learn how to survive on your own. I looked up at the two massive security guards who had been standing by silently. Please escort these women off the premises, I instructed. If they resist, call the local precinct and have them arrested for trespassing. The guards did not hesitate. They grabbed Diane and Brittany by their arms, hauling them up from their knees. The two women screamed and sobbed, begging for one more chance, but their cries were entirely useless. The guards dragged them across the lobby, pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors, and shoved them out onto the cold concrete sidewalk. I stood in the warm, dry lobby and watched through the glass as the heavy Los Angeles rain poured down on them. They stood on the wet pavement, shivering, completely ruined and entirely alone. I turned my back on them for the final time and walked to the elevator. There was only one loose end left to tie up, and it belonged to the only person in that family who actually deserved a happy ending. 3 weeks after watching my former mother-in-law and sister-in-law get dragged out of my office building, I received a text message containing a scanned copy of a final divorce decree. The signature at the bottom belonged to a Los Angeles County family court judge. Terrence had officially won his war. The family court system in California is notoriously complicated, often defaulting to a 50-50 split of all marital assets. Brittany had walked into that courtroom carrying a cheap handbag, fully expecting the judge to grant her lifetime alimony and order Terrence to liquidate half of his veterinary practice to support her lifestyle. She turned on the fake tears, played the victim, and accused Terrence of financial abuse for freezing their joint accounts. But Terrence was prepared. Thanks to the digital dossier I had provided him, he did not just bring an aggressive lawyer to the hearing. He brought a mountain of indisputable, heavily documented evidence. Terrence submitted the American Express fraud investigation report, directly into the court record. He provided years of bank statements proving that Brittany had systematically engaged in the severe dissipation of marital assets. He showed the judge how she had secretly funneled his business profits to buy luxury goods, and how she had actively participated in a conspiracy to hide her brother's expensive mistress using my stolen credit cards. The judge was absolutely disgusted. Family court judges have very little patience for documented financial fraud. When the gavel finally fell, the ruling was a total massacre. Because Brittany had committed active fraud and recklessly drained their shared resources, the judge invoked a rare penalty clause. Terrence was awarded 100% sole ownership of his veterinary practice. Brittany was denied any form of spousal support. She was ordered to assume the entirety of her massive credit card debt, and as a final crushing blow, the judge ordered her to pay every single cent of Terrence's legal fees. Later that evening, I walked into an exclusive, dimly lit rooftop lounge in West Hollywood. The jazz music was playing softly in the background, and the panoramic view of the Los Angeles skyline glittered beneath us. Terrence was already sitting in a private semicircular leather booth. He was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, looking effortlessly handsome, and at least 10 years younger than he had just a month ago. The heavy burden of supporting a toxic, ungrateful family had been completely lifted from his shoulders. As I slid into the booth across from him, the waiter arrived with a chilled bottle of vintage champagne and 2 crystal flutes. Terrence poured the drinks himself, handing one across the table to me. "To the eradication of parasites," Terrence said, raising his glass with a wide, genuine smile. "To freedom," I replied, clinking my glass against his. We took a sip of the crisp champagne, letting the absolute victory of the moment settle over us. Terrence leaned back against the leather cushions and told me the rest of the story. He said Brittany had completely collapsed in the courtroom when the judge read the final order. She was legally required to find a job immediately just to begin paying off the court-ordered restitution and her lawyers. "She got hired 2 days ago," Terrence told me, swirling the champagne in his glass. "She is working the cash register at a mid-tier retail clothing store at the local mall. She has to wear a polyester uniform and stand on her feet for 8 hours a day. She is living in Diane's cramped guest bedroom right down the hall from where Connor used to sleep before the feds took him." I smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. They both got exactly what they earned. Terrence looked out over the city lights, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know, I used to think I was trapped," he said quietly. "I thought because I married into that family, I just had to endure the subtle racism, the constant disrespect, and the financial bleeding. I thought taking the high road meant staying quiet. But watching you stand up and completely dismantle their entire fake reality, it woke me up. You showed me that good people do not have to be collateral damage for toxic families." "You were never collateral damage, Terrence," I told him firmly. "You built a successful business with your own hands. You save animals for a living. You have real value. They only looked down on you because they were standing on a pedestal built entirely with other people's money." The second we kicked the pedestal out from under them, they fell right back to where they belong. We finished our champagne in comfortable camaraderie. We were the outsiders. The 2 people Diane and Connor had deemed unworthy of their prestigious bloodline. Yet here we were, sitting at the top of the city, wealthy, successful, and completely free. We had survived the infection, and our new lives were just beginning. Exactly 1 year and 2 months passed before I saw my former husband in person again. The setting was not a luxury estate or an upscale steakhouse. It was a sterile, heavily guarded federal courtroom in downtown Los Angeles. I sat in the second row of the gallery wearing a tailored navy suit flanked by Mr. Harrison and Agent Davis. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom opened, and a United States Marshal escorted the prisoner to the defense table. Connor was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, posturing sales executive who used to spend hours agonizing over his custom hair care routine was entirely gone. He had lost at least 20 pounds. His face was gaunt. His skin carried a sickly fluorescent pallor from a year in a maximum security holding facility, and his shoulders slumped forward in permanent defeat. He was wearing an oversized bright orange jumpsuit with the letters DOC printed in bold black ink across his back. The steel chains connecting his wrist to his waist clinked loudly in the quiet room as he shuffled to his seat. He did not turn around to look at the gallery. He did not look at his mother, Diane, who was sitting 2 rows behind me, sobbing quietly into a crumpled tissue. He simply stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, his eyes hollow and vacant. The reality of the federal justice system had broken whatever was left of his massive ego. The presiding federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, did not mince her words. She looked down at Connor from her elevated bench and delivered a scathing reprimand that stripped away any lingering illusion of his victimhood. She stated for the official court record that Connor had not acted out of desperation or momentary poor judgment. He had acted out of malicious, calculated greed. She detailed how he had systematically attempted to defraud his wife, maliciously damaged her professional reputation, and ultimately committed cyber espionage by stealing segregated taxpayer funds earmarked for national defense. Connor stood up when instructed, his head bowed, his hands shaking slightly as they rested on the defense table. The judge read the final verdict. For 3 counts of federal wire fraud and the theft of government property, Connor was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Because it was a federal conviction, there was no possibility of early parole for good behavior. He would serve every single day of those 8 years behind bars. Furthermore, the judge ordered mandatory financial restitution, meaning that if he ever managed to secure employment after his release, a significant portion of his wages would be garnished by the government until the $250,000 was fully repaid. The heavy wooden gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack. It was the sound of absolute finality. Connor closed his eyes, a single tear cutting through the pale skin of his cheek, but he did not speak. He was handcuffed once again and silently led out of the courtroom through a side door, vanishing into the concrete bowels of the prison system. As the courtroom began to clear, Agent Davis turned to me and handed me a thin manila folder. He told me he thought I would appreciate reading the latest update from their International Liaison Office. I opened the folder. Inside was a high-resolution surveillance photograph taken at an international airport terminal in Cyprus. It showed a young woman in an expensive designer tracksuit being aggressively detained by 3 armed Interpol agents. It was Sienna. Agent Davis explained that Sienna and her boyfriend had enjoyed their stolen $250,000 in Dubai for exactly 11 months. But the United States government does not simply forget about stolen defense funds. Federal authorities had meticulously tracked their digital footprint across multiple international banks. The moment the couple attempted to leave the United Arab Emirates to renew their tourist visas in Cyprus, a red notice was flagged. Interpol agents intercepted them at passport control before they could even collect their luxury luggage. They were currently sitting in a foreign detention center stripped of their designer clothes and their stolen cash, awaiting formal extradition back to the United States to face their own federal conspiracy charges. The money was being recovered, and Sienna was about to trade her luxury penthouse lifestyle for a federal holding cell. I handed the folder back to Agent Davis and thanked him for his exceptional work. I walked out of the federal courthouse and stepped into the bright, warm California sunlight. The air felt incredibly clean. Total legal and social justice had been executed with flawless precision. Every single person who had participated in the toxic delusion of that family had been systematically dismantled by their own greed. They had tried to break me, but the law had functioned exactly as it was designed, to punishing the wicked and protecting the innocent. I walked toward my car, ready to close this chapter and return to the peaceful, extraordinary life I had built for myself.